So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first session of our Advancing Publicly Engaged Philosophy Conference hosted by the Public Philosophy Network. On behalf of the conference committee, and in particular, Noel McAfee, my co-program chair, and Sharon Marr, the co-chair of the network, and also Gwen Taraska, the assistant conference coordinator, which means the person actually running everything. I want to thank you all for coming and joining us for what we believe will be a stimulating and productive 2 days of workshops, papers, panels, and discussions about how philosophers and philosophy can engage and re-engage with the important issues of our day. Now, time is short, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions, but before starting, I do want to thank and acknowledge our sponsors and financial supporters for the conference. The American Philosophical Association, especially David Schrader and Eric Weber, the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy, George Mason University, the Rock Ethics Institute of Penn State, especially Nancy Twana, who unfortunately at the last minute wasn't able to make the meeting. The W.K. Kellogg Chair in Agriculture, Food and Community Ethics at Michigan State University, which is held by Paul Thompson, who's with us, and the Center for the Study of Interdisciplinarity at the University of North Texas, especially Bob Froderman. I'd also like to thank my colleagues here at the Center for American Progress, especially Nick and Andrew, who are not only co-sponsoring the panel, but also graciously providing the video stream of this event, which we posted later on the Public Philosophy Network, which you can then use freely, splice and dice, mix and match however you want to on YouTube. Over the next 2 days, we'll be discussing the particulars of an array of specific policy topics which we are or would like to be more engaged in, as well as strategies for overcoming the professional, institutional, and social hurdles to making that engagement more effective and lasting. Tonight, however, we're going to take up the broad theme of how values do and don't influence, or could change, our current, sometimes productive, but increasingly divisive public sphere. In the US now, as at other times in our history, we hear voices from the right and the left laying claim to unique insights on the terrain of values that we have lost and that need to be found. So while Tea Partiers rally against forces that they claim have devalued the unique normative origin of the American Republic, protesters currently occupying Wall Street challenge the dictum that value in public life should be understood only as willingness to pay. Regardless of the merits to either side, the resulting clash contributes to, in the words of my friend Peter Baker last June in the New York Times, standstill nation, where governance of any form seems a thing of the past. With us tonight are 5 accomplished figures who represent a range of engagement at the intersection of values in public life. I've asked them to give us a good start to this meeting by leading us out of our comfort zone to discuss this cluster of topics and other issues. So you have their full biographies in front of you. So briefly, and this is kind of odd to say, but on my far right, William Galston, Senior Fellow and Ezra Zika Chair in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. To his left, E.J. Dionne, columnist for the Washington Post, Senior Fellow at Brookings and University Press Professor at Georgetown University. In the middle is our moderator for tonight, Hanna Rosin, Senior Editor at The Atlantic and co-founder of Slate's XX website. And then next to her is Mark Sagoff, Professor of Philosophy and Public Policy and Director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at George Mason University. And finally, right next to me, Anita Allen, Professor of Philosophy and Law at the University of Pennsylvania and a member of the President's Council on Bioethics. So thank you again for coming, and I'll turn it over to Hanna.
Hi, and welcome everyone. I am not a philosopher, which will become immediately apparent, or in the next 5 minutes apparent. And so when I thought about this panel, I thought of work by a fellow journalist, my friend Rick Perlstein, who wrote a book called Before the Storm about the defeat of Goldwater. And the thing that I loved about this book is that it's not about conservative ideas. There's been lots of great books about conservative ideas. It's about how conservatives turned the moment of Goldwater's defeat into a lesson about making ideas matter in politics, how to put ideas into motion in politics. And that's why this turned out to be a critical moment in American history. The way Rick Perlstein puts it is, they learned how to make the anger boiling inside you ennobling, productive, powerful, instead of embittering. One of the subjects we're going to talk about today is whether conservatives have mastered this process better than other people. But more broadly, we're going to talk about this idea of, this notion of thinking of ideas as things in motion like this, as little boxers, let's say, that you sent out into the rink with, each of them with a t-shirt with your own slogan, kind of battling against each other. And so the idea of thinking of ideas the way Barry Goldwater did. As Andrew said, the defeat of Barry Goldwater the rise of Barry Goldwater is often thought of as the end of the age of consensus, what led us to the standstill nation that Andrew talks about. It means that we have dysfunction, we don't accomplish things. Every 4 years we have to debate evolution all over again. There's a lot of bad things that come with the end of the age of consensus. But for the purposes of this panel, let's also think of the end of the age of consensus as an opportunity, because what it means is that ideas are constantly in battle. In fact, it creates an opportunity for people like you to send your ideas aggressively and forcefully out there. So that's the kind of thing we're going to talk about today. I'm going to let each of the panelists make a presentation about this topic, and then we will discuss them amongst ourselves and then with you guys. So let's start with Bill Galston.
Well, thank you, Hanna. Wow. I think maybe I better lower this a little bit. There we go. I just want to kick the discussion off by calling your attention to what I take to be two important features of publicly engaged philosophy. By the way, I think that's a very nice phrase. I think it is. I think it is better than public philosophy, and I think it's something that you can work with quite profitably. The first of these features is suggested by the title of one of the books written by the last American philosopher to have genuine public influence, John Dewey. Right? And Dewey wrote books with titles like The Public and Its Problems. And the fact that he was comfortable with titles like that contributed to his influence, because he was saying something important. Namely, that he wanted to take the public's problems seriously, begin with them, raise them to a higher power of understanding and perhaps even of efficacy. He didn't want to take a philosophical problem and bring it to the public. He wanted to take the public's problems and to bring them to philosophy, but not just to take them to philosophy, but to enrich them and to make them more vibrant and more effective. Now, note that in doing that, and here I guess I would quibble a little bit of the title of the panel, we're talking about more than values in public life. Public philosophy does two other things as well. It conveys some understanding of how the world works, and also some understanding of what might be called effective agency, how to move from a situation that the public regards as unsatisfactory to a situation that is both from a normative and a public standpoint preferable. And a lot of the contemporary debates in American politics that have brought us standstill nation are not necessarily debates about values. They're profound disagreements about the way the world works. And the consensus that existed 50 years ago has broken down at that level as well. You know, just a few years after Richard Nixon said we're all Keynesians now, that ceased to be true. And now we have a situation where one party says if you engage in a Keynesian stimulus, the economy will grow, and the other one says no, that will make it shrink. One party says if you cut taxes, tax revenues will go down. The other one says no, if you cut taxes, tax revenues will go up. Under these circumstances, classic political deliberation becomes, to say the least, much more complicated. Here's the second feature of publicly engaged philosophy that I want to underscore, and I'll introduce it with a quotation from one of my favorite books, Aristotle's Rhetoric. And Aristotle says towards the beginning of the Rhetoric, quote, "When speaking of converse with the multitude, our proofs and arguments must rest on generally accepted principles." So, publicly engaged philosophy achieves efficacy in part by drawing its principles from the pre-existing public understanding. Draws it, if you will, from the fund of the public culture. Now, the public cultures are not constructed architecturally the way buildings are built all at once. They're historical accretions, which means that there are all sorts of swirls, eddies, and internal contradictions. And philosophers going back to Socrates have figured out how to mobilize those internal contradictions to make ideas move. Nonetheless, in order to be a publicly engaged philosopher, you have to pay attention to these pre-existing principles, Our most effective public leaders have always understood that. It is no accident that when FDR wanted to broaden the philosophical basis of the New Deal, he talked about the 4 freedoms. He understood just how potent the value of freedom was in American public culture, and so he defined what the Europeans would have defined as social democracy as, quote, freedom from want, right? Similarly, Martin Luther King appealed to the Declaration of Independence and also to the ethics of Christianity. He didn't want to invent a new principle and then bring it to the public. He wanted to say to the public, if this is what you say you believe, then here's what you ought to do. Here's what you ought to be for. And most other statesmen do so as well. And let me, in conclusion, give an example of another example of how this might work and how it doesn't. Let me take the example of the death penalty. Now, there are different ways of coming at the issue if you think the death penalty is just wrong and ought to be abolished. One way is to say, well, it's cruel, or it's an affront to human dignity. It's unacceptable per se, to make arguments of that sort. The problem is that you're starting off with a public, the majority of which believes exactly the reverse, and simply contradicting them will not persuade them. It will merely affront and anger them. There's another strategy that could build on what people already understand to be the case. That as a matter of fact, that whatever its proportionality to the offenses that give rise to it, it's the most severe punishment available. We can argue around the edges, but I think most people believe that. And also, it is the one punishment that offers no possibility of either correction or compensation. Now, taking as one point of departure those two premises, you could certainly argue that at the very least a warranted death penalty can't be based on forms of evidence that are known to be deeply flawed, such as eyewitness testimony alone. And then you might go on to pose the question, well, when we think about it, is there any kind of evidence, even DNA, that is immune from error? What about the Amanda Knox case, et cetera, et cetera? And then you could simply pose a rhetorical question, namely, how much risk, if any, should we be willing to run that the most severe and least correctable punishment has been imposed erroneously? I would submit to you that beginning from generally accepted beliefs about what is the case and what ought to be the case, you can make more progress as a publicly engaged philosopher than if you try to make up arguments based on dignity and cruelty that simply contradict the entrenched views. Let me, if I have one more minute, do I?
Sure.
Only if I
like lenient moderators.
Yeah. Let me give you an example of how not to do it. From a more.
No, save that. Don't you want to save that? Shouldn't we save that? Do you want to save
Oh, I shouldn't have said the thing about lenient moderators.
Now I feel like I have to be mean.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
Go ahead. It's all right.
Okay. Yeah. Here's an example of how not to do it, drawn from an American philosopher whom many fellow philosophers hoped would have a wider public influence than he turned out to have, namely John Rawls. Now, Rawls argued famously that we can't use character and effort to ground desert-based claims because a person's character, quote, depends in large part upon fortunate family and social circumstances for which he can claim no credit. The notion of desert seems not to apply to these cases. We can have a long philosophical and empirical argument as to whether Rawls was right or wrong in saying that. But I can tell you an argument of that sort as a basis for public engagement is an exercise in futility. You can talk for 100 years and every philosopher in the country can say exactly the same thing, and you will not persuade the American people that matters of character and effort are determined by external circumstances.
Excellent. Thank you. EJ.
Thank you. First of all, I love Bill Galston for many reasons, but he is maybe the only person I know, certainly the only one who served in a Democratic administration, who could say casually one of my favorite books, Aristotle's Rhetoric, and absolutely be telling the truth. So it's great to be with you. I also want to salute that gentleman over there who is wearing a Yankees hat. because he could be about to watch the game tonight. Instead, he's here. Though I hope he'll forgive me that I'm a Red Sox fan.
It's at 8:30, so we're fine.
Oh yeah, when I see you run out the door. I'm a Red Sox fan, so I will not be rooting for the Yankees tonight, but we can discuss the values and ethics of Red Sox and Yankees fans after this is over. When we talked about doing this, we all talked about issuing a certain number of provocations. And so my basic provocation is to ask, why is it that people on the left and progressive side of politics have actually engaged far less, I believe, and I'm prepared to defend this, in philosophical argument than people on the right? Why have philosophers essentially had more influence on at least the way conservatives talk, and possibly on the way conservatives think, than progressives, liberal or socialist or social democratic philosophers? More than 15 years ago, some of you may know Todd Gitlin's book in the Twilight of Common Dreams. And he noted that while the left was marching on the English department, the right took the White House. And there was a lot to that. And I think more than they ever want to admit, intellectuals of the left are influenced by the cultural politics that dominate their time. And while the political right spent the 1980s, 1990s preaching the gospel of privatization, the virtue of pursuing individual satisfactions, many in the Progressive Academy were engaged in their own form of withdrawal. And aesthetic radicalism had replaced political radicalism. Battles over texts and canons displaced the fight over whose interests would be served by government and whose ideas would define mainstream politics. It seemed that the right, far more than the left, had learned from the Italian communist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, who understood the power of ideas in shaping political outcomes and the outcomes of economic struggles, even though Gramsci was in fact a vogue on much of the academic left. It's typically the left, of course, that's always accused of politicizing the academy, but I think starting back in the 1960s, that Rick Perlstein wrote about so well, it fell to the American right to devote itself to producing politically usable ideas. Its narratives on the futility of government, the futility of social reform, the dangers to the economic sector from state interference, and the primacy of moral breakdown as the explanation for poverty shaped the political discussion really right into our time. Now, something changed after 2001. And I think that to the extent that there is a more engaged academy, including philosophers, the person who caused it was the philosopher named George W. Bush. I think it's incontestable that it was a reaction to the Bush presidency that produced a kind of a crisis of conscience within the academic left, among academic progressives, and brought them back to public engagement in a way that, as Bill pointed out, had been far more routine in the days of John Dewey, or even in the 1950s than it had become in more recent years. I was really sort of caught short on this issue some years ago when a conservative friend called me one day and he asked, what kind of ties do liberals wear? And he wasn't asking, do they go Hermes or Brooks Brothers or the guy who sells them on the street corner. It's sheep, if you must know. I like animal ties. I used to get them for my kids, and then I decided I liked them. He wasn't asking about that. He was asking, what kind of ties did people wear to celebrate their intellectual heroes? Because after all, conservatives regularly wore Adam Smith ties, some wore Hayek ties. My friend told me that a few traditionalist Catholics actually wore St. Thomas Aquinas ties. And I was hard-pressed to think of what ties liberals or progressives wear. I mean, I haven't seen Truman or Roosevelt ties, or LBJ ties, or Martin Luther King ties. I certainly haven't seen John Stuart Mill ties, Reinhold Niebuhr ties. And I think if my friend was onto something by merely asking the question that you might say that liberals, progressives, and Democrats are under-theorized. They tend not to view themselves as inheritors of a grand philosophical tradition, or they're suspicious of such traditions, or they're suspicious of too much theorizing. And I think some of that may owe to the tradition of John Dewey and how it later got interpreted. Pragmatism as a philosophical concept was very serious, and I think over time pragmatism got drained of all of its actual philosophical meaning and became a revolt against the use of philosophy by progressives altogether. There is something else going on here. Two great political analysts, Lloyd Free and Hadley Cantrell, wrote a very influential article more than 50 years ago where they observed that Americans were ideological conservatives but operational liberals, by which they meant that at a philosophical level, Americans would tend to give answers to questions that suggested a skepticism about government and loyalty to a whole series of conservative propositions. But when it came to actual programs, they tended to endorse very specific liberal programs. So they may be conservative, but they were for Medicare and Social Security, environmental regulation, federal help to schools, minimum wages, family leave laws more recently. And I think one of the things that also happened on the left, and again, this is as much the fault of politicians and perhaps people who write newspaper columns as it is of you philosophers, but there was an assumption that the philosophical argument was lost. They sort of took their Free and Cantrell whole and gave up on the notion that it was important in public to offer serious philosophical underpinnings for such ideas as the idea that the government can improve the workings of the marketplace, that public provision of social insurance can make society fairer or better or more productive. Anti-government arguments in particular were for a very long time not countered at all. I'm actually glad President Obama has started making some speeches on this subject actually to start an argument that we should have been having long ago. And of course, you're all familiar with the story which you've heard over and over. I think the origins of it are from Hillary Clinton, who once told of encountering a woman in 1994 during that healthcare fight, and the woman demanded that government not interfere with Medicare. I think that the tendency is to say, does that woman think? I actually think the failure is on the other side. The failure is on the part of liberals and progressives for not discussing the fundamentals enough. I think that one of the reasons I am so happy you are having this meeting is because I think philosophers, and particularly progressive philosophers, need to become far bolder. Politicians need to become far bolder in talking about the philosophy behind their ideas. I actually ran across a great quote from a certain John Podesta, who happens to run the place we are in. He said some years ago, the left of center presents a confusing picture of where it wants to go. The alternative is to be coherent, to work from values that make sense from people. And so it will probably not surprise you when John Podesta calls all of you at the end of this meeting to do the kind of work we're engaged in here. I just want to close by talking about what does it mean to engage, this is a bad sentence, to engage in publicly engaged philosophy. We have to edit the first engaged out of that sentence. I like, and here I really very much identify with the underlying premise of what Bill said. I've always liked Michael Walzer's idea that the truly effective social critics are embedded social critics. They're embedded in their society, and they operate at least as much out of love as out of alienation. Now, love comes very hard, I think, in the academic world. Love is not a word commonly used, although there's probably a philosopher of love somewhere in this room. In The Company of Critics, a book some of you probably know, Walzer quotes Adam Michnik, the great Polish intellectual and activist, who said, a movement that does not honor society's constant values is not sufficiently mature to undertake the reshaping of that society. And Walzer draws, I think, the right conclusion from this. He says criticism is most powerful when it gives voice to the common complaints of the people or elucidates the values that underlie those complaints. Note the twin obligations Walzer imposes on the critic: the democratic obligation to voice common complaints and the intellectual obligation to elucidate values. The latter can be quite subversive of accepted understandings, exposing, as it typically does, the ways in which a society ignores or violates the values it claims as bedrock. And that is why, without any planning in advance, I ended up with Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln as, I think, two people who engaged in this process in a quintessential way. King from Scripture and from the Declaration of Independence, and Lincoln also from the Declaration of Independence. I think it's fascinating that Lincoln's probably most important political speech, Harry Holzer says it's the speech that made him president, was the Cooper Union speech. And Lincoln was determined to root the argument against slavery in the thinking of the founders of our nation. He did not want to say that ending slavery was a radical proposition, that it marked a break from our past. He wanted to argue that this is what the founders had in mind all along. And it proved to be a very powerful argument. Last point, I had discovered some years ago that George Will and I share a thing in common, an important thing in common.
A sheep tie.
Oh, no. We might,
baseball?
I don't think he would be caught dead wearing a sheep tie. But we both love the same Max Weber quote. And each of us has used it on a number of occasions. And Max Weber's famous quote, or at least the quote we like, is, "Politics is the strong and slow boring of hard boards. It takes both passion and perspective." And I think the examples of King and Lincoln give us some interesting options for intellectuals, because Weber also talked about the politics of responsibility and the politics of absolute ends. And I think in politics one needs both the critic who exercises the politics of absolute ends and the politician who engages in the politics of responsibility. King was, in a sense, a prophet to Lyndon B. Johnson. Frederick Douglass might be said to have been a prophet to Abraham Lincoln. I think within the world of philosophy, there is a division of labor too, because I think some philosophers may want to heed more closely to the Walzerian rule, which I personally subscribe to myself. I think others can operate outside that framework and be outside critics, if you will, but I still think they need to adhere to the broader ethic of responsibility, and politics being the way it is, they need to be very, very patient sometimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I already have a lot of questions I want to ask both of you, but I will hold them off. Go ahead, Mark. Your turn.
Is it my turn?
Yes, it is.
How would you like that?
Good.
Well, I want to thank this wonderful conference. I agree that publicly engaged philosophy is what needs to be done, and it's being done. It has been done very well so far. I want to just draw a little bit on what Bill Galston said about a difference in the way the world works. Different political views have different approaches to not only values, but their conceptions of how the world works. I'm just going to take the environmental case. I'm going to limit what I'm saying to the environment. And what's going to come out of this is the eerie feeling that we're all liberals here. I mean, the last two talks, wonderful. And the place we are, I'm sure you cannot really be right-wing here. And I mean, it just would not work. But there has to be some room for the conservative view, and I want to show how that is coming up in the environmental case in terms of the real difference, with a philosophical difference with many liberals about how the world works. And take this one example, which I think is just embodies and represents, exemplifies where we are politically, but also philosophically with the environment. So a little background. The Clean Air Act says that every 5 years, the EPA has to review its basic national air quality standards for the criteria of pollutants. It's like a huge job, and it happens every 5 years. It's probably too much, but at any rate, 2008, it was time for the big review of the ozone standard. Ozone is a precursor to smog, and tailpipes, certainly comes out of power plants, boilers, it makes cement, whatever it's going to produce, some ground level ozone or some smog. And 2008, George W. Bush was president, Stephen Johnson was the EPA head. So that they put the best science together, and the best science said, and the Science Advisory Board's best science said, it's going to be 60 to 70 parts per billion. That would be the ambient standard of, for a place like this. That would respect what the law requires, which is the value in law was public health and safety. And Stephen Johnson, the Republican administration, said that 70% was too tough. It would impose too many costs on industry. They would go for 75 parts per billion. Okay. So then something happened. Obama was elected, and Sheila Jackson became head of EPA. And Jackson said, we are going to review this and get this down to the appropriate level, which has to do with public safety and health. So the goal here, just stated right in the Clean Air Act, fairly libertarian. One person shouldn't impose his risks on others, or filth on others, or ozone on others, or whatever. And we're going to stick by that. We'll lower the standard. And so the environmental groups and there were many medical groups, like the American Lung Association, had sued the Bush administration for the lower standard, saying that the 75 parts per billion was illegal. But they all backed off when Obama was elected, because they were sure that the Obama administration was going to lower the standard to 70 parts per billion from what it was before or during the Bush administration, which is 84 parts per billion. So the standard remained at 84 parts per billion. It was never brought down. The environmentalists and the health groups waited on their suits, expecting the announcement of the 70 parts per billion standard. And they waited, and they waited, and the years passed until a new scientific panel completely confirmed what the old scientific panel had said. And on top of that, a huge cost-benefit analysis was done. Both of these documents were released 2 days ago. Sheila Jackson actually did release, not as we'll see in the public register, but in the Federal Register, but she made public this 436-page document that has the huge cost-benefit analysis that shows that the benefits of bringing down the ozone standard are much greater than the costs, and the billions here and the billions there I won't go into, and the science behind it. But there was a sudden jolt to the entire environmental community. I mean, a sock in the solar plexus when on September 2nd, 2011, Cass Sunstein, who is the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, sent a letter, which I have, you can get it on the web everywhere, to Administrator Jackson, telling her that she could not go forward with the 70 part per billion standard. And shortly, at about the same time, the president issued a statement that said, the president issued a statement very much saying the same thing, that in these troubled times, economically, we could not impose these extra costs on industry. So let me just read the letter from Cass Sunstein, just a couple of key paragraphs. He says, I have, I'm sorry, this is the statement from the President. I got my papers here. I have continued to underscore the importance of reducing regulatory burdens and regulatory uncertainty, particularly as our economy continues to recover. This was a separate speech by President Obama. With that in mind, and after careful consideration, I have requested that that Administrator Jackson withdraw the draft ozone national air quality standards at this time, that she not move forward with the 70 part per billion. So I'll just finish up with this letter by Cass Sunstein, which brings all the values at issue to the fore and shows how deeply they conflict. First, he says, OIRA, that is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OMB, that reviews all major regulations for the President. OIRA shares EPA's strong and continued commitment to using its regulatory authorities, including the Clean Air Act, to protect public health and welfare. That's the first value. Over the past 2.5 years, the EPA has issued a significant number of rules. We also, to do this, we also recognize that the relevant provisions of the Clean Air Act forbid EPA to consider costs in deciding the stringency of national air quality standards, both primary and secondary. This is Sunstein speaking. You're not even allowed to consider costs, and in the environmentalist literature, which is that people, Tom McGarity, for example, underscored this, and he said that even Justice Scalia, in a unanimous Supreme Court decision, had found that environmental law, like the Clean Air Act, could not consider costs. So what's going on? The first thing that Cass Sunstein says is you can't consider costs. Then he goes on and says that it has to be, the law has to be based on the best available science. And he talks about the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee and what a great job it did. And then he continues by talking about the cost-benefit analysis. And the EPA has now released, this is a couple of days ago, this humongous cost-benefit analysis. Now, philosophers all the time debate whether you can do cost-benefit analysis, whether you can make the intangible tangible, whether you can put a value on life, a price on life, whether willingness to pay is a measure of anything, and so forth. So, but Sunstein has it all here. First, he said you can't take costs into account because you can't do this. It has to be science-based. And secondly, even if you do it, and you try to make the intangible tangible, and you put the value on public safety and health and the loss of life and the days at work and all that kind of stuff, you still come out with enormous net benefits for this regulation. And then he says nevertheless, he said, I am requesting at the President's direction that you withdraw the final rule. That's exactly what he says. More generally, the President has, after all of this filled up, he says, more generally, the President has directed me to work closely with all executive agencies and departments to implement the executive order of regulatory review that Reagan had first put into place, to minimize regulatory costs and burdens, particularly at this economically challenging time. The President has instructed me to give careful scrutiny to regulations, and then he says, we look forward to continuing to work with you to protect public health, safety, and welfare, and our environment. And this is the last letter, the parting words of the letter, while promoting economic growth, innovation, competitiveness, and job creation. Well, I'm just going to leave this by saying that we have all the values here. We have public health, safety, and health. We have the libertarian values of, people shouldn't, 4,000 people should not be killed by ozone, 4,300, or whatever the scientists said would be additional deaths because of it. We also have the problems that, well, we're going to make the intangible tangible, and sort of willingness to pay on safety and health. We need to do that. And nevertheless, the President is not going to put this regulation into effect because It's going to raise prices for energy. It's going to make all of these businesses pay more. They can't compete as it is. It's going to destroy jobs, and it would, in destroying jobs, in affecting as it would the macroeconomy, all these microeconomic and even ethical considerations go by the by. The problem here is that cost-benefit analysis, while trying to make the tangible tangible, and I know there are people like me in this room who've done a lot of stuff in debating and decrying and deriding cost-benefit analysis. They can't make the intangible, the soft value variables, and all that kind of stuff. In fact, cost-benefit analysis doesn't make the tangible tangible. The actual cost, and not in compliance costs, these are all there, but in the macroeconomic effects. I mean, Keynes was right, there's no connection between the macroeconomy and the microeconomy. What is the connection of all this to what people care about now, which is jobs, jobs, and jobs? And unless we environmentalists can share these public concerns and these values, we will actually not be engaged in public philosophy.
Yeah, that was a great conclusion. I thought the conclusion was going to be, why bother articulating all of these public values if you're just going to shelve them by the end of your letter? It went in a different direction, so I'm glad about that. Anita, your turn.
Thank you. Well, all three of the other speakers have been very badly behaved and have gone over the prescribed time limit. I have to decide, will I do the same or will I be a good girl? I'm not so sure.
You will show love. You will share the public concerns. Have empathy.
Thank you. Okay, so Socrates was the first philosopher, and he was also the first publicly engaged philosopher. He didn't write any books. He just talked to people, right? Just talked to people. And he made people very mad. And the question I want to begin with is whether we can do this thing, public philosophy, without making people mad. Mad enough to kill us. Now, if your substantive views happen to be mild and boring enough, nobody will want to kill you. But if you have anything to say that is the least bit progressive or subversive, there really is a personal price potentially to be paid for engaging in public philosophy, engaging philosophy publicly. So I'm a PhD trained philosopher, like most of you. I also went to law school after earning my PhD precisely because I felt that academic philosophy was isolated and isolating. I'm very pleased to see this desire, this trend, this movement toward more engaged form of philosophy. I know I wanted to talk to real people about real things. Because when I was 10 years old, the following things were illegal: integrated public schools, interracial marriage, birth control, cohabiting with your lover. When I was 17 years old, all those things were legal. How'd that happen? Right? I mean, it's really very disorienting. And I wanted to be in a vocation in which I could figure such things out, these transitions, these tectonic shifts, right, in the way the world worked. Plus, there were plenty of people who told me I didn't belong in philosophy. As one of my friends put it, Anita, you have too much juice for philosophy. Okay. To move something, you have to push, right? And to push, you have to have your hands free, right? But your hands might be chained together by oppression and its aftermath. You might be holding babies in your hand and you can't push. There's a real kind of demographic or sort of sociological or sort of social underpinning to being able to do public philosophy that I think we need to not turn our eyes away from. And it's great to be able to do what Walzer, Dewey, Aristotle, Weber, Aquinas, King, Lincoln, Johnston, Frederick Douglass, and K.S. Sunstein have done. But not all of us are situated in the world in such a way that it is likely we will be, dare I say, permitted or invited to participate in that that public discourse and to assume those kind of exalted social and political and legal roles. So I feel very fortunate because I have actually found a way to push. It's been through a series of very great coincidences and luck, but it was mentioned in my introduction that I'm currently serving on Obama's Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, and I have as my job to bring ethical and philosophical insights to questions such as, should we move in the direction of more and more synthetic biology, despite the environmentalists? Should we condemn the human subject research that U.S. doctors performed in Guatemala in 1946? But it's a role which invites people like me to draw on my normative and my logical philosophical training to help to hopefully to improve public policy and scientific and medical practices. But I've done other things as well, and some of these folks have too done even more of this kind of thing. Television, radio, blogging. We do it all because we believe that being able to leave the ivory tower and talk to people about things that matter are important. But again, that may not always be possible. To get to the television camera, you have to look and sound a certain way. Do I list too much for the prime time or not? Is my hair correct? Is my skin correct to be a voice on that particular issue? It's a combination of having the desire to push, a combination of having the opportunity and the will to push, and having the luck to be able to pull it all off. I totally agree with most of what I heard today. I feel as though among the things which makes participation in public life so frustrating is that there are all these sort of binaries, left and right and black and white and male and female and northern and southern and liberal and conservative and pro-choice and pro-life and Republican and Democrat. And so sometimes it feels like we're going through a ritual, right? A ritual of philosophical engagement and not really philosophically engaging anything or anybody. And it's great in those moments when you feel like you've broken through some of those dichotomies and been able to actually contribute something to contribute to progress toward some better set of social welfare values or some better set of institutions and practices, some better legal outcomes. But the categories are extremely confining and constraining, and they limit what one can say and do in so many contexts. Well, on one hand, we have this vast array of outlets to do philosophy. Again, it's television, it's radio, it's the blogs, it's the internet, it's the books, but yet there are these sort of limitations on who can get to those, who can access those various media and outlets, and also when one gets there, what one can say, given the way we sort of artificially divide up our society into these dichotomies of, again, left and right, black and white, and so on. The problem of gender and public voice is so interesting to me. I was very taken by the large number of philosophers who were mentioned as inspiring one another and this and that, and I began with Socrates. Who has written the philosophy article that's been the most cited article of all time? Judith Jarvis Thompson, her article about abortion. That's the most cited, most reproduced philosophy article of all time. Something about that violinist and women's bodies grabs us, and she's done more good to educate people about the nuances of rights and rights discourse and public values, I think, than any other philosopher in recent times, maybe even, dare I say, Rawls? No, I won't say that. I won't say that.
Please, speak on
Get an argument out of me.
Okay. So, I would love to hear, have the conversation start, so I won't take up more than my 7 minutes, but just a couple of additional thoughts. To me, there's no shame in reaching very, shall I say, low in terms of trying to engage the public. I confess, I have been an ethics columnist for Oprah magazine. Okay, so why? Because it seems to me that it's worth engaging the American public wherever they are. You know, if their ethical life is dominated by questions about, you know, romance and food and taxes and mortgage payments, well then let's have a conversation about those kinds of things. Because maybe those kinds of conversations might mean that when the bigger stuff gets, you know, on the table, they have a better sense of how to begin to think systematically and carefully about those larger questions, questions about environmental justice, or questions about labor, questions about the, you know, the gold standard. I mean, maybe, you know, because if people like us are willing to share our thoughts about the humble, smaller topics through our magazine columns or our blogs or our newspaper columns, then maybe people will be willing and able better to begin those bigger conversations. One last thing. So there's sort of two different types of public engagement that I think kind of characterize my own experience, and I really don't know sometimes which I enjoy more. The one is the you're invited to participate. So you're invited to be a member of the Bioethics Commission, and you're invited to make ethical judgments in a very constrained and formal context, and produce beautifully written sort of, you know, reports and so forth. And there's just like the sticking your nose in it kind of a thing too, where, for example, there's something going on in the world, it's just driving you crazy, and you decide to become a strong voice against that thing. I'll just give you one relatively modest example. A couple of years ago, these cadaver shows, you know, became very popular. Science museums all over the country were putting on the cadaver shows. And when the cadaver show Body Worlds came to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, I was very curious, but also a little disturbed. So I decided I would become a journalist, and I would go and I would look at the show, and I called them up and I told them I had a newspaper column, I wanted to write a story about the Body World. And I went and I saw and I felt and I reacted, and I wrote about the Body World, and I wrote from an ethical voice of opposition to the idea of displaying plastinated human corpses in museums, helping to raise the revenues of our flailing science museums. And I felt as if I was a lone voice, because my other bioethics colleagues, even the ones at my own university, had not found anything wrong with Body Worlds. They had, in fact, been on committees that were formed to ethically evaluate the show. But when I wrote this piece and was published in a newspaper, I got tons and tons and tons of wonderful email from people in the general public who said, you know, this was really bothering me. I mean, this seems to be out of whack with our reverence for the dead, our respect for life, our commitment to science in a way which is also such a deference to the body. So I found people out there who shared my beliefs. So I was trying, on the one hand, to educate, but I also learned. So this is the sticking your nose in something that's not your business sometimes is just as fulfilling as serving on a formal commission or an IRB or that kind of thing. And I'll stop there.
And it turns out a lot of those bodies were illegally traded in underground international markets. Someone actually did an expose as those exhibits became more popular. Someone finally tried to figure out, like, where do all these dead bodies come from, you know, and did an expose. I want to say one other thing. Your mention of Oprah reminded me of a very funny story. A think tank, not this think tank, but a think tank in Washington, decided that they were going to create something called an influence grid for the stories that the journalists and writers who worked at this think tank produced. And the influence grid, you would be rated if you wrote a certain story about healthcare or something like that on whether it was a paradigm shifter. You got 10 points for paradigm shifter. You know, sort of novelty. You got 20 points for novelty. And then you got rated for where, you know, where the story got picked up in the world. And one of the stories that a woman wrote got picked up by Oprah. She was invited on Oprah. How many points did the think tank give her? 0 for Oprah. I thought, okay, that's the difference between the think tanks and an average journalist. She was very excited. So you know, where is influence and where does it come from, and what are the avenues that you can do it through?
I think they have the wrong standard.
Right, exactly. Well, one issue that's come up a lot here is sharing public concerns. This notion, you know, whether it be jobs, thinking about jobs and not just your ideas in some sterile way, or the death penalty and how people feel about the death penalty. One thing from the discussion that wasn't clear to me is one thing I think the conservatives good at is not necessarily sharing public concerns assumes that there is an existing public concern and that you pick it up and empathize with it, as opposed to what I think conservatives have become very good at, which is framing public concern. In other words, defining something, saying this is what the public concern is, and then the public picks it up as their concern. The Medicare thing being a perfect example. You frame the public concern as limited government. People then think of themselves as people who believe in limited government, even though in every way that they act, they don't necessarily act that out. So I wanted you guys to talk a little bit more about what that empathy looks like. You know, you're a philosopher, and how would you deal with this jobs question, for example? How would you pull that into your understanding of what is the correct thing to do in a situation of regulatory standards? Just to take a most specific example, or the death penalty for that matter. Just to get really specific here about how one would take a public concern that you don't naturally agree with or take into account, and how would you enact that?
Could I try a different one on because I have been struck by over the last year, the ebb and flow between concern about the deficit and the concern about job creation. Mm-hmm. And that if you rooted, if the rule was root the public discussion in the central matter of public concern, jobs would have overtaken the deficits, and we would have been talking about jobs and job creation a lot longer. Yet the deficit seized the public's attention. Now, part of that was that there was a lot of persuasion done, and when I say persuasion, I don't just mean 30-second ads or manipulative persuasion, but a lot of argument. I think argument in general is underrated in politics, and I think the greatest presidents make arguments. And there was a lot of argument that somehow the deficit itself was a cause of our unemployment problem, and that getting the deficit in order would create public confidence, or as Paul Krugman says, the confidence fairy would shine upon you. And I thought that, and then you had sort of, I think finally the president, who had fed one narrative for a long time, started and grabbed and fed the other. But I think there's an interesting sort of a whole set of issues there about how did what by all rights was the larger matter of public concern get subordinated to the deficit, and what kinds of arguments about the government's relationship with the economy, let alone where all Keynesians now know we're not, it seems. How did that all happen? And I think that's sort of a very rich area to think about.
Well, that's a perfect example, because to me it's not intuitive at all that the public should now, at this moment of great unemployment, greatly start to care about deficit cuts. Right. So, was that taking the public concern into account, or was that an intellectual ruse that somebody did that worked for some reason?
See, this is I think an excellent example of 2 points that a number of different panelists have gestured toward, including me. One of them is that in a public argument, it is almost never the case that there is a single value at stake, or a single valued thing. There are always, in Mark's example of all of the things in Cass Sunstein's letter is another example of that. There are lots of different things that people care about, and they're not really arguing about whether it's right or wrong to care about those things and to attach a certain valence to them. The real argument is about priorities among the things that we rightly care about. That is 95% of public argument. And then the argument shifts. If the question is what is more important, what takes priority over what at a certain point, then the question shifts to the next level, namely, how are these things connected in practice? How does the world work? And there is a respectable conservative economic argument to be made that causally links large deficits to the phenomenon of unemployment. It's not, we all know how those arguments go, and to the extent that people are persuaded not that deficits are good, or the deficits are good when they thought they were bad, or not that unemployment is good when they thought they were bad. But the extent that they're persuaded there's a certain kind of relationship between those two things, where just about everybody agrees on the moral valence, then the argument shifts. Framing never changes our understanding of what's good and what's bad, but it changes other facets of our understanding.
So let's take that to the environment. Would a publicly engaged philosopher be able to frame the argument of jobs in terms of the environment? In other words, would the right thing to do be not to put those things in opposition, but find a way to link those two ideas?
Absolutely.
Which Obama has tried to do,
Absolutely.
but I think in a sort of tepid way. You know, this clean industry creates a few more jobs here and there, but not in any way that shifts the fundamental frame, just like we'll create a few more jobs in these various industries.
Obama and many environmentalists are praying for a miracle. Some kind of energy that's cheaper than coal and clean. And right now, the president of the stimulus bills and other bills has thrown an enormous amount of money at this wall of technology. Cylinder was the bad, was the bad sheep. But speaking of sheep, but the hope has to be through innovation and the kind of change in our educational, our scientific, the kind of investments we make. So I'll just leave it at that. And Obama has to speak in terms of investment, but that's kind of a right-wing way to speak instead of protection. Yeah.
Since we've talked so much about political priorities, Anita, one way I like to think about where conservatives have influence, because they so explicitly use ideas, and where, say, liberals, I know you don't like the dichotomies, but just stick with me for a minute, is in the change that happened between when you were 10 and when you were 17. That's a different kind of influence of ideas. It's kind of a cultural influence of ideas. If you take gay rights as the very easiest example of that. I often think to myself, conservatives have lost the culture, whether publicly or politically they win the culture war, year after year we move progressively towards more rights, from 10 to 17 to now. How did those ideas, what did you discover about what happened between when you were 10 and when you were 17? What was your conclusion about that?
It's an interesting question. I didn't put gay rights on my list of what changed between 10 and 17 because, of course, it took longer before we got rid of the sodomy, anti-sodomy laws and so forth. But the mystery is still in a way there, right? Why it was that at that moment in time, in the 1960s, we finally began to understand the value of a more inclusive society, one in which women were able to become full citizens through greater control over their educations, their bodies, their marriages, and so forth. But I think we're still kind of struggling with that, So we're still struggling between conservative and liberal framings, for example, of the abortion issue, where we went from pro-choice to that doesn't work too well, that sounds too selfish.
Right.
So we talk about families and about how important it is to protect
families.
families.
Like gay marriage, right? I mean, I think that was a great turning point. I mean, why the gay rights movement decided to push marriage as it just normalized.
But look at the success that the right has had with reframing the abortion issue now as protection of women. We protect families, as the liberals say, but we protect women from the doctors and the procedures that are cruel or that are offensive to maternal values. So I guess I'm not so. I don't have an answer to the question what changed, but I do think that that there's some degree of public will changing. How that led to such amazing shifts in such a short period of time, it's still public history.
I mean, that's why the divining of public concerns is something I can't get my head around, because I feel like the best publicly engaged, thinkers, they frame the public concerns. They sort of,
Could I? Just a couple of things. One is on this investment word. I think the liberals actually overplayed that hand in a big way. And everything became an investment, and no matter what you were spending money on. And my favorite story about this is one day I called Ann Lewis, a prominent Democratic political consultant, very sharp woman, and she was kind of making fun of this tendency, and she said, yes, we used to talk about immunizing little children against disease. Now we call it an investment in human capital. And actually, when you think about it, I actually think immunizing little children against disease, as she was suggesting, has a better shot at winning support. So there's that. But to go back to the economic business, why is it that a Keynesian view of how you stimulate the economy, which is we ought to have a bigger stimulus, we ought to be stimulating more now to speed our way out of this, and I do think it is connected to a long argument that our conservative friends made about government efficacy and the notion of government as a destructive or potentially oppressive force. And so, my conservative economic friends would argue, no, it lost on the merits of economics, but I have this hunch that it actually lost ground on the basis of a philosophical attitude toward government. And when I hear these anti-government arguments, I hear a sleight of hand that ignores the difference, say, between monarchy and despotism on the one side and democratic government on the other side. It doesn't mean that democratic governments can't oppress too, but they are different in kind and in what they do, and yet a lot of the rhetoric, the public rhetoric that we hear, acts as if there is no difference in kind between this kind of government and that kind of government. I do think that's the kind of question that publicly engaged philosophers can help us elucidate.
And they can draw on other nations' experiences to help push the case for certain sorts of values. I think that Europeans are a bit ahead of us when it comes to social welfare values, and they rely on some of the same philosophical traditions that we do, some of the same thinkers that we do, but yet they see a way within the toolkit of Western liberalism to find a rationale for a right to health care, for example.
But I would, I guess this is to continue my solitary drumbeat of criticism against the title of the panel. I would resist the premature rush to values and the clash of values as the explanation for what's going on. Let's take this, let's take the hard sell that Keynesian economics has become. Here's a different explanation, and that is that most people who are not professionals or experts in an area draw their understanding of that area from their own personal experience. And and from that standpoint, if you're in hard times, well, what do you do? You're more careful, you retrench, you pull back, you try to spend less, you try to save more. The problem with Keynesian economics is that the macro is the reverse of the micro. Right. The micro experience says do one thing, but then we have this fallacy of composition, the paradox of thrift. Government should do the opposite of what ordinary moral understanding says you ought to do. That makes the sell much more complicated, because the conservative argument is that the macro and the micro look just the same, and therefore, oh, Mr. and Mrs. America, you don't need the experts to tell you what to do. You don't need these fancy economists from the Ivy League, because your own robust common sense is the best guide to public policy.
So what was the New Deal then? I mean, why was there a point when you could make the opposite argument so convincingly that in fact the government's role is to help, assist, spend a lot of money, that the government acted as parents? I mean, there's lots of points of intuition that you could appeal to in a moral soul,
but in fact,
the mother.
But in fact, if you look back to the New Deal, which I do almost obsessively, Keynes went to visit Roosevelt once in the White House, but Roosevelt was not a Keynesian, and Keynes went away from that meeting shaking his head. This man doesn't understand anything. Well, but there was something that Roosevelt understood that Keynes didn't, namely that when people are sufficiently desperate and a president goes before them and says, my approach will be what he called bold, persistent experimentation. Try something. If it doesn't work, try something else, but above all, try something. That is a direct quote from Franklin Roosevelt. And the reason that he was able to persist in that strategy was that people saw tangible results. They were desperate. Right? He takes office, the entire banking system collapses. Within 2 weeks, he has solved that problem. The banks reopen, savings are secure, and credit such as was began to flow again. He told Harry Hopkins, get a public works program up, and 3 months later, 750,000 people were at work. In other words, you can make the sale if the promised results come to pass. 4 years after he was elected, unemployment had gone down from 25% to 16%. You might say no president could get reelected with unemployment at 16%, but if people think things are moving in the right direction because of what the president has done, then hard sells become a lot easier. So it's not just a question of values and arguments. It's a question of getting the promised results close enough to the time you promised them so that people think you had something to do with it.
So Roosevelt was really going with people's moral intuitions. I mean, first of all, he gave up on Keynesianism too early, which is why we had this recession in '38, so he wasn't completely convinced himself, as Bill suggested. But he wanted the payroll tax connected to Social Security, even though he understood it was regressive, because he wanted people to feel ownership of this account. And he said, I wish I had the quote in front of me, but it was basically, they are never going to be able to get rid of my program if I do this. And guess what? Up to now, he has been absolutely right. And so it was,
by the way, is so that no damn politician.
Yes, that's right. Can take it away from people. And I do think that going with popular moral intuitions is a useful thing. And I'm a small d Democrat. I do not like the idea of arguing that the American people don't understand. First, it's a lousy way to win an argument. But secondly, I do think there's a lot to popular understanding. And that the purpose of people who argue in public is to try to influence that popular understanding, not condescend to it.
Anita, I'm going to let you have the last word before we throw this open to
I think this is a great conversation. What is the philosophy of thrift you're saying is sort of the underlying approach or value or perspective? I think some people believe that when the going gets rough, you borrow and you leverage. You don't save, you borrow and you leverage. That's also a part of the, it's not the thrift, the Benjamin Franklin version of citizenship that I think you're putting out here. It's in conflict with other senses the public has of what you do when the going gets tough. And so I think that it's just interesting that the idea of deficit spending is so controversial when for a lot of people, in fact, do exactly that. When the going gets tough, they spend money they don't have.
So people won't lend it to them.
Right. I think you have to have a lot of money before the word leverage even enters your mind.
All right, we're going to take questions because we have a game to watch soon. So. Do you want people to come up?
No. Gwen's going to go around with the mic, and I'll just call on people as they raise their hands. In the back there, to the right.
Hello, thank you for sharing your comments with us. I was especially happy to hear the references to the ancient Greeks, Aristotle and Socrates. And the text I think of when I think of public philosophy, it wasn't mentioned, it's Plato's Gorgias, Socrates versus the rhetoricians. And the part that everybody remembers who has read the Gorgias, I think, is where Socrates says philosophers are like the doctors who aim at what's best for people, and the rhetoric people are like pastry bakers. Does everybody remember that part? Okay, because they just aim to flatter people. And I was wondering, what, in your opinions, is the difference between philosophy and rhetoric, if not that? Is philosophy just really intelligent and informed rhetoric? What distinguishes the two?
That's an excellent question. It leaves me wondering whether elections are won by the pastry makers.
I think politics is the art of the philosophical pastry maker. That's a Clintonian answer. What do you think, Bill? That's a great question.
Well, here first of all, I did not choose the quotation from Aristotle's Rhetoric by accident. because I do think that publicly engaged philosophy is rhetorical to a higher degree than academic philosophy is or can afford to be. And so there is that rhetorical element, but the question is, for publicly engaged philosophers, what is the rhetorical exercise in the service of? Right now, now the political equivalent of the pastry chef wants nothing except the rewards of office and the psychic income and the much more material rewards that come from occupying office. The publicly engaged philosopher can try to use the various sorts of rhetorical strategies that Aristotle sketches so brilliantly in the service of not only pushing, in Anita's wonderful metaphor, but moving public understanding in a certain direction, but taking as its point of departure where the public begins. And so most people will say, on reflection, I'd rather be healthy than sick. Right? I don't want to spend the rest of my life being sick. And then someone could say to them, well, I have bad news for you. If you keep on doing exactly what you're doing, you're going to get sick and you're going to get sicker and you're never going to feel right again. And so I'm not telling you what to value. What I am saying is if you're serious about what you say you value, then you're going to have to change your ways. Now that's rhetoric in the service of the position. And I would maintain that good physicians trying to get people to change their ways have to be rhetoricians as well as experts.
But at some point, I think we think the philosophical attitude is one of being open to surprising conclusions. But I think you're quite right that you can be on one level open to surprising conclusions, but once you find a conclusion, you're then willing and able, if you're good, to use rhetoric to further promoting that conclusion.
I was just thinking, I mean, in a sense, you're talking about a technical philosophical distinction, and yet I'm thinking of I'm still thinking of my philosophical pastry chef, and the overlap is let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, from King's I Have a Dream speech. Is that rhetoric, or is there a philosophical statement at the root of that? I think there might be. All men are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. That's a very powerful piece of rhetoric that I think is arguably a philosophical statement. So I guess all I'm doing is pushing back against the distinction, because I think it's a real distinction, but I think there are moments when the two ally.
In great speeches.
Yeah. Yeah, because great speeches are philosophically serious speeches.
But what Plato had in mind, and of course this was part of a vigorous critique of democracy, was the temptation to attain influence, power, prestige, and all the other good things of life through pandering. Right? He's talking about pandering, and there is a danger that if you simply try to use public understanding for your own advantage, that you will not try to change them. You will simply try to use them. And that is a perennial temptation of democratic politics. And we can see it everywhere around us. And it has very bad consequences.
Yes.
Judith, why don't you go next?
Shall I just speak?
Sure.
No, we need to get this on.
Gotta get the microphone. There we go. Thanks. Thanks very much. Several people pointed out that some of the great philosophical rhetoricians have drawn on values that are very old, thinking about Dionne drawing on King and Lincoln, both drawing on the Bible and the Declaration. And of course, the values on in those locations are both older than those sources and multicultural in many ways. But also, as Galston points out, there's a lot of conflict among the values that many people hold dear. So there's always a real selectivity, isn't there, in deciding where to start, which values to evoke. And then the question becomes too, if I might add just another layer to my question that I'll pose in just a moment, there's a question of who one is as a philosopher. Am I a lone voice crying out in the wilderness? Or am I part of some kind of democratic process where I understand myself to be speaking for and with some people and seeking to evoke others' voices as well, rather than to persuade single-handedly somehow? So here's the question. In 21st century democratic persuasive uses of rhetoric, who is or should the philosopher be in choosing among the values and in inviting or not inviting different interpretations of those values into the conversation?
Yeah. Are you asking what is the philosopher's role, or what is?
It's sort of two things. On the one hand, you were talking about there's a role. Well, you know what? It was Sagoff who said there's a role for conservatives here. So just thinking about any of those biblical values, any of those declaration values, and not just some of the things that we don't like at all anymore, but thinking about the ones that seem to have enduring weight. There are different ways of reading the values that matter, whether you're talking about property or the general welfare or about the right of citizens to participate in their own governance. I mean, those are all things you can read in very different ways, and they can draw you in kind of different directions. So if you're going to start with those shared values that are still live for us in William James's sense, then what is the perspective, would you say, from which to do this? Shall we understand ourselves as inviting others into a Deweyan collaborative inquiry, or shall we think of ourselves as prophets calling out folks?
I think, well, first of all, in a way, to quote the scripture, to everything there is a season. I mean, I don't think there is a final answer for every person as to whether they are a Deweyan collaborator or a prophet in the wilderness. And I think the democratic discourse needs both. A great Walzer essay ends with the words, every democracy needs its kibitzers. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. But I am struck by this elucidation of conflicting values, partly because I believe today I put the last words on paper for a book I am writing, which is making an argument about American history and American politics. It's called Our Divided Political Heart. And I argue that from the beginning of the Republic, we have had a tension within ourselves, within the political discourse, between our love of individualism and our affection and quest for community. And I'm arguing that the communitarian side of us has been regularly ignored or suppressed in the way we have talked about ourselves, and yet I'm arguing that there is a vital line of thought this way from the very beginning. Why would someone bother to write a book like this? Well, I'm interested in the idea, and I was concerned about the suppression of the communitarian idea. But I do think that how we understand who we are is very much an issue in our politics right now. And I spent a lot of time reading and rereading American history because I think one of the reasons we can't agree on who we are right now is because we can't agree on who we've been. Now, having invested a lot of time in this, I think it is a useful exercise. And my hope is that comes out of this project is that we could argue about these things more clearly, and then on the persuasive or rhetorical side, I do hope I persuade people to take our communitarian side more seriously, and that has a number of consequences. So that's how lately I have tried to answer that question personally as the best I can do on that.
That would be a very helpful service. I'm actually going to we are completely running out of time, so I'm going to hear you in the back and ask the last question. Yes, go ahead. And then...
All right.
this on. Yeah, so I just want to throw this out. To what extent then do philosophers have a responsibility to maybe raise the literacy of the public? So we've talked about engaging the public, but what about the public engaging philosophers, right? So I work in bioethics, and we talk about health literacy a lot. So you raise the health literacy of your target population so that they have a better understanding of what you're doing, and it makes the whole process much more effective. So
yeah, that's back to the original, the public and its problems that we started this discussion on. Who wants to, Anita, do you want to take that on?
Well, I think I maybe took the question more literally than you intended it, but I'm thinking about my own work in Philadelphia with a nonprofit, the West Philadelphia Alliance for Children. And what we do is we open closed public school libraries. It turns out that Philadelphia doesn't have enough money to staff its school library, so they're all closed down. So our nonprofit has opened 11 libraries so far with the goal of making sure that those little African-American inner city kids have access to books. And then that's a foundation, and then one can't engage them, they can't engage us if they can't understand a language, they can't read, they can't interpret. So sure, I think that literacy quite literally is a very important skill that will give rise to the ability of that kind of mutuality of understanding that you were describing. And in relation to your question, I also understood it in a somewhat different way, I think, than EJ, in terms of maybe you're suggesting that philosophy itself is not a lonely enterprise, that we work together, whether we're feminists, philosophers born of struggle, but that groups of philosophers, movements of philosophers working together are going to have the biggest chance of pushing society, as opposed to the lone wolf philosopher, the lonely voice in the wind.
That's a beautiful place to end. I know that you guys have anything else. I feel like that was just that's a perfect shout out for the rest of the conference.
It's a fine place to end.
Thank you all for being on the panel. Thank you, Anita, for